Today I'm going to talk about what it is that we do. What is LCT? What does it mean to explore legitimation codes? Why should we bother with this framework? These are the sorts of questions asked by newcomers to the approach, as well as by the academics and managers who fund our research and pay us to teach. And sometimes we can struggle to get across to others why we choose to work with LCT. Now, partly this is a product of something very positive. As you've just heard, LCT is growing fast, so fast that though it's a very young field, we already need textbooks and introductions to the framework. They're coming, but that's not the whole story. It's not just a lack of simpler answers to these questions. We also need the right kind of answers for the fields that we work in. Now, as you know, LCT tells us that we are located in social fields of practice in which actors cooperate and struggle for status and resources, so we must justify our existence. LCT, legitimate thyself. But as we know, the kinds of answers that are acceptable, that are seen as legitimate, depend upon the nature of these fields. And right now, those fields are structured in ways that can make it difficult to explain what LCT is all about. And in fact, I'm going to argue that it's likely we will be increasingly portrayed in ways that we don't recognize and associated with positions we don't hold. That is, unless we develop answers that make sense to those fields. Now, luckily, we have a framework that allows us to analyze and solve those kinds of problems. So today I'm going to use LCT to discuss why we choose to work with LCT. And I'll do that in three main stages. Firstly, I'll briefly discuss how we're likely to be positioned by the ways of thinking that dominate the fields we work in. And I'll highlight how we can offer a different picture of what we do. Second, I'll argue that what makes LCT fundamentally different to other approaches is that it allows us to make the invisible visible. And in the main part of my talk, I'll illustrate how we do that and why it's important by looking at examples of teaching practice. And third, I'll end by briefly arguing that what we do is crucial for the wider world we live in and quite possibly the future of life on Earth. So I'm going to start the conference with humble and modest claims. In the course of all this, I'll introduce some new concepts that look at focus. I'll develop the concepts of autonomy codes and show how to use those by analyzing examples of classroom practice. I'll offer a model for successfully teaching with media that are not designed for education. And I'll hopefully make visible something about LCT itself, which is how it can make the world a better place. So hopefully, there's something for everyone. And if that can't hold your attention, then while you're talking, you can use LCT to analyze how the talk itself embodies autonomy tours. It'll embody a number of semantic waves and a giant big specialization wave as well. And if you're still not entertained, seriously, you're at the wrong conference. So I start then by looking at how the problem of how to legitimate LCT. Now, there's an old joke about driving along and a pedestrian asking you for directions and to say Wollongong, and you say, well, I wouldn't start from here, they say. I wouldn't start from here. And I sometimes feel that way when trying to describe LCT or explain LCT to scholars steeped in other approaches to education and society. LCT can be so different to their ways of thinking, it can be difficult to know where to start. I want to say, well, I don't want to start from here. And I'm not just talking about the problem of knowledge blindness. That's difficult enough to overcome. But this is deeper still. At our first conference 2 years ago, I said those who work with LCT were benevolent misfits who don't fit into the existing categories. And that's the problem I'm again pointing to here. LCT doesn't fit into the existing categories created by a way of thinking that dominates the fields we work in. What is that dominant mindset? Well, those who were at the first conference may remember I showed this painting, which is the School of Athens painted by Raphael in the early 16th century, and it includes every major figure of ancient Greek culture. And I argued that it portrays two constellations. At the center of the painting you have Plato and Aristotle, and they're demonstrating their differences. Plato on the left is arguing, for example, for an abstract, deductive, top-down account of the world. He wants to go up into the clouds, and Aristotle on the right is saying that we need to start from the facts on the ground. And everyone in this painting is associated with one or other of these positions, arranged into two big groups. So Raphael's painting in the Vatican portrays a binary constellation of practices and beliefs. And these constellations aren't of just historical interest. These constellations have evolved over the centuries, and particular ideas have been added and others have been removed, and still others have shifted between the two. But thousands of years after the ancient Greeks, we're still regularly faced with what Ernest Gellner called the old familiar confrontation between a cold, abstract, reductionist and scientistic constellation and a warm, grounded, experiential and humanistic one. There are many more attributes that can be added to the list on this slide, but as I've argued elsewhere, we find these oppositions in a whole range of places. We find them in the two cultures debate between sciences and the humanities. We find them in claims made for student-centered learning over instruction. We find them in the ways theories are described. So, for example, the way in which Bernstein is described as being much more technicist than Bourdieu. And I've written about all of those, showing these constellations. The fields we work in seem to be bewitched by this opposition. Now, two attributes of this big dichotomy are key for what I'm going to be discussing today. First is the either-or way of thinking it embodies. This mindset gathers up a group of practices as a single constellation. That then is positively charged as progressive and grounded and in touch with subjective, lived human experience. It then groups up all other practices into a separate constellation that then is negatively charged as conservative, detached from lived reality, experience, it's seen as technicist and so on. In other words, the big dichotomy is a binary constellation, as I've said, that's axiologically charged using LCT, one generated by either-or thinking. And a separate attribute is that the big dichotomy demands you choose one or the other. It asks, which side are you on? Are you on our side or are you one of them? And your answer is universal. You're on that side for everything. I don't just mean that once you're associated with one part of it, you're associated with all parts of it, which I've written about before. That's true, but also that once you've chosen a constellation, when someone has, they have a tendency often to believe that's the answer for everything. Like a child with a hammer thinking everything's a nail. They believe the solution is that set of codes, whatever the question is. And we see this in education, for example, with universal solutions. Universal solutions in the 70s, progressivism. Since the 90s, constructivism and student-centered learning. Each time it's offered as a universal solution to everything. So, for example, constructivism began as a theory, as a model of learning. And then it became a model of research and a theory of curriculum design and teaching across the whole disciplinary map and across every kind of institution. So how will, having painted that with very broad brushstrokes, how will LCT be positioned within this big dichotomy? Well, you don't just write endless prose, you draw diagrams. That's not good. Worse, you draw Cartesian planes with plus and minus signs on them. That looks a little dodgy. You draw profiles like this. That looks a bit like mathematics or engineering. And your approach isn't named after a person. You're not Matonians, you're not Matonists. You work with something called legitimation code theory, which sounds very complex and impersonal. And it's described as a multidimensional conceptual toolkit, which sounds a bit technical to me. There are many more exhibits I could draw on to make a damning case against you lot. Now, of course, we know that LCT includes attributes from both sides of the big dichotomy. It includes both knowledge and knowers. It waves between, it talks about waving and weaving between abstract and concrete ideas. It involves quantitative and qualitative methods and so on. But when faced with fields underpinned by knower codes, underpinned by axiological cosmologies and either-or thinking, then having any attributes from the negative constellation is enough to be positioned in that constellation, because you must be on only one side of the big dichotomy. So we're screwed, basically. Unless there's something that we can do about that, and there are at least two things The first is a strategic move to use the language of the positive constellation, which values axiological meanings. Now, we normally describe LCT in very epistemic terms for obvious reasons. We're trying to make our empirical reference as clear as we can. We're trying to ensure our arguments are logical and consistent so that we can generate as much explanatory power as we possibly can. But we can also describe LCT in more axiological terms. Let's take, for example, what I consider to be the biggest leap forward from Bernstein to LCT, which wasn't specialization, it wasn't semantics, it was the breaking away from types and boxes. And this was how knowledge was discussed previously. It tended to be discussed as a bunch of boxes, often 4, each strongly bounded from each other, no way of seeing differences within each type, no way of analyzing change between them, and nothing empirical really fitted into any box. And that's true not just of how Bernstein's work was often discussed and used, less so his actual ideas, but often how it was used. But there's also most models of educational knowledge. And using Cartesian planes was a really big breakthrough. Now we could see the empirical in its multiplicity, in its complexity. We can see competing codes within an object of study. We can see that there's all 4 codes of whatever that might be going on here. We can change over time within a code and across codes. You've seen me use those slides a lot. Now, I normally describe all this sort of thing as by saying LCT combines a typology of 4 principal modalities with a topological space of infinite positions. Well, that might be catnip to mathematicians and linguists and engineers, but not to many others, funnily enough. But we can also redescribe that as LCT helps you think outside the box, because that's true. Or LCT embraces change. Similarly, I often describe LCT as excavating beneath surface empirical features to explore the organizing principles underlying practices. Again, yum, yum, yum to knowledge code people, but yuck, yuck, yuck to many others. We can put that another way. LCT enables deeper understanding. Or, and I have Alan McConnell to thank for this one, LCT reveals the DNA of practice. Or take translation devices. They don't just traverse the distance between abstract concepts and the concrete particularities of each empirical object of study to enable data to speak back to theory. That also means LCT embraces difference. It puts its concepts at risk. Or because it doesn't tell you what the concepts look like in your object of study, you have to enact them. LCT empowers people. Now, I'm not saying that we have to abandon epistemic meanings for axiological ones, because I don't believe in the either-or. We can have both and. My point is that we don't have to sit and wait to be positioned negatively by the big dichotomy. In any case, that's just one way forward. The other, more important way is to deny, defy, and dissolve the big dichotomy. And we do that by making the invisible visible. In other words, by what we do, we show the dichotomy is false, and we model a different way of doing things. How do we do that? That's what I'm going to illustrate. And I'm going to do that by looking at examples of classroom practice, and that's going to be the main part of my talk. And I'll return right at the end, when you're utterly fatigued, to dissolve the big dichotomy, and it'll all come round in a circle. So the data I'm going to analyze was collected for the PEAK project into knowledge building, run by Sarah Howard, Jim Martin, Len Unsworth, and myself. We focused on secondary schools, and we recorded whole units of study, that's about 6 to 8 hours of video, in history and science classrooms in years 7, 8, and 9 at 3 schools with different social profiles. That's a lot of data. And we've been analyzing all that data using 4 dimensions of LCT. That's a lot of analysis, some of which are being presented as papers at this conference for the first time. And here I'm going to focus on a history class in Year 8 at a school whose student population was relatively low socio-economic status. To set the context to what I'm going to discuss, we'd already analyzed a unit of study in Year 7 history at the same school. And that teacher expended a lot of energy in maintaining order. She repeatedly said shh a lot, and she moved students around in order to deal with noise, shouting, and an awful lot of low-level constant disruption. She spent a lot of time dealing with students who didn't know what they were meant to be doing, even well into an activity, 20 minutes into an activity, and she has to explain it again to them. And as a consequence, there was relatively little time spent discussing history content in that class. The next year, we studied Year 8 history at the same school with many of the same students, but a different teacher. They were no longer disrupting lessons. They were no longer lost and asking questions about what they should be doing. Instead, they were attentive, focused, and asking questions about history content. So much more history was being covered in these lessons. This raised a question: what happened? We considered the obvious reasons, but once we started ruling them out, I was sad to see the first one go. We were left with the possibility that the teacher had something to do with it. However, if you watched him teach, you might think otherwise, and you may think otherwise. He's softly spoken, he's unhurried, he's laid back, he's the opposite to the common perception that student engagement comes from teachers being animated and excited. Indeed, several scholars who've seen him teach thought he was disengaged and uninterested, and an example of the worst kind of uncaring teacher. So the question is, how did this seemingly nonchalant teacher create a space where the students are on task and learning content? And what the hell has this got to do with legitimating LCT? Now, teaching is a fiendishly complex business, so the first question actually involves a whole range of legitimation codes, and I'm only going to focus on one aspect of his pedagogy, which is how he moves around the autonomy plane. The second question is that I'll argue at the end that LCT enables us to see this practice, and which is invisible to many. To do that, I need to briefly introduce two sets of concepts to you. The first set of concepts are about the focus of discourse. Now, I've always distinguished focus from basis, where the focus refers to what's being written or spoken about, and the basis refers to the principles underlying the practice, how it's being legitimated. So say I'm talking about a problem with my back, that's my focus, and I can legitimate that by saying a number of things in any number of ways. For example, I know I've got a problem because I feel pain. That might be a NOAA code. Or I know because I've had a medical scan. That might be a knowledge code. And legitimation codes are always about the basis, not the focus. So the basis has had all the attention in LCT, and rightly so. It does the heavy lifting and explanations. But when studying classrooms, we found that we needed to distinguish three different things that were being discussed in class. So we distinguish between content focus, when content knowledge is being discussed, such as medieval Europe, or in history, or the solar system in science. Directional focus, when teachers or students are discussing how to undertake an activity, such as watching a video or conducting an experiment. And behavioral focus, when they're discussing behavior, such as classroom management, or how one should behave in general. Those are for classroom data. If you're studying other phenomena, you might need different distinctions, though I should add the point is not to try and list everything that could be a focus, because that list is infinite. It's just about what's useful for your question. Our question is, why does this teacher spend a lot less time repeating instructions and maintaining order, and more time teaching content? So those three were useful for us. And I'll use those concepts to analyze the focus of the classroom discourse. And to analyze the basis of that discourse, I'll use autonomy codes. And those concepts have been fundamentally reworked over the past few years, and we'll finish writing those papers up and make them available as soon as we've finished running this conference. For now, I'll briefly outline the main things you need to know for this talk. Autonomy begins from the very simple premise that a set of practices is made up of constituents or parts that are related together in particular ways. That's it. Those constituents could be actors, they could be ideas, they could be machine parts, they could be body movements, they could be sounds, anything. How they're related could be based on explicit procedures, formal rules, tacit ways of working, how we do stuff around here, among others. Autonomy explores the issue of insulation. How insulated are a set of practices from others? And it answers that by considering how insulated are the constituents and how insulated are the ways they're being related together. So positional autonomy refers to the strength of insulation between constituents within a contextual category and those positioned elsewhere. For example, if my actions effectively say there should be stronger insulation between what's positioned here and what's positioned somewhere else, that would be stronger positional autonomy. And relational autonomy is about how those constituents are related together. So for example, if my actions say there should be stronger insulation between how we do things here and how they do things somewhere else, that's stronger relational autonomy. They're very general definitions for analyzing all kinds of data. In this paper, I'm analyzing knowledge expressed by teachers and students in classrooms, and for that we can enact these concepts by simply asking where things come from. So for here, positional autonomy is about where constituent and content knowledge comes from, because that's my focus here. If it's from within what we call the target, it's stronger positional autonomy. If that content knowledge is from somewhere else, it's weaker. And relational autonomy is the purposes to which that knowledge is being put. If it's for teaching and learning the target knowledge, it's stronger relational autonomy. And if it's for some other purpose, it's weaker. And I'll come back to how we define the target shortly. As usual, we can, and for those who are doing semantic waves at all, we are really high up at this point, but we will be coming back down again later shortly, don't worry. As usual, we can describe a continuum of strengths of each, which gives us 4 main codes. I'll briefly introduce these, but don't worry, because I'm going to also illustrate them. Sovereign codes are where positional and relational autonomy are both strong, and it valorizes from within and oriented towards within. So using stuff from inside the context of category for purposes associated with it. The motto here is home is where the heart is. Exotic codes are the opposite. They draw on practices from somewhere else, weaker positional autonomy, and they put them to other purposes, weaker relational autonomy. The motto here would be status lies elsewhere. Roman codes are where practices have weakly insulated positions. They use practices from somewhere else, but they turn them to purposes that come from within. So their motto is, even if you're coming from elsewhere, when you're in Rome, you do as the Romans do. And Trojan codes are the other way around. Things may be inside the city walls, but they're used for other purposes. What you're doing is within, but it's for some other reason. Don't worry if you didn't follow that. I'll be illustrating those again and again. Now, like all LCT planes, this isn't 4 boxes. It's a topology of infinite positions, or as I can also say now, it helps you think outside the box, and it embraces change. So we can analyze practices such as parts of a lesson or parts of a text or whatever it might be, and you can see there's more than one code here. It's dominated by a sovereign code, but it's not all the same. So LCT embraces difference. And we might say analyze a lesson in another discipline or at another time in another classroom, or the dispositions actors bring, and then we can compare their autonomy codes in that way. But today I'm going to be doing something slightly different. I'm going to be tracking pathways around the plane over time. So this is one pathway. It's moving between codes. Or it can be simple. It can be like that. I should add that this first pathway that I did, that's called an autonomy tour. Again, I'm going to be illustrating it. But it starts in the sovereign code, it goes out to somewhere else to another code, and it comes back. And as I'm going to show, I believe autonomy tours are a key to integrating knowledge from other sources, from different sources. They involve leaving your target, leaving home as it were, going out to embrace other knowledge and other purposes, and then bringing it all back home to your target. And in contrast, this is a one-way trip. So for example, as you'll see one as well, but an example now is, for now, is a teacher may start by teaching history and then go out to include, say, everyday experience, and they never come back to history. If those are new to you, as I say, don't worry, I'll be discussing examples as I go. Finally, how do we get these things on a plane? How do we place them? So as you know, LCT concepts can be used to analyze many things, so translation devices come in handy. Sarah and myself, with Jodie and Eleanor, have created one that works for all kinds of data and for both positional and relational autonomy at the same time. And here I've filled it out with some examples from what I'm going to discuss. In black is the first level for deciding what's stronger and what's weaker, plus or minus, and the target is simply what makes a context or category distinctive. And today I'm discussing knowledge, the teaching of knowledge in classrooms, and here the target we decided was what the teacher intends to teach. In our examples, it's secondary school history curriculum, specifically the New South Wales Key Stage 4 history syllabus. That's what the teacher said was his target knowledge in these lessons, and teaching that knowledge was his target purpose. So stronger positional autonomy is when he's discussing knowledge from that syllabus, and anything weaker positional autonomy is when he's discussing something else. And stronger relational autonomy is when he's using whatever he's discussing for the purpose of teaching that syllabus. And yes, you guessed it, weaker is when he's using it for some other purpose. Again, I'm going to be illustrating this with examples. I just need to expand on that just a little bit, just to distinguish, because I'm going to need this. 2 parts of the target, core or double plus. That's the specific unit of study. In this case, it's going to be the medieval world. And that's the core. The ancillary is just a single plus. It's topics from other parts of the target, from other parts of that Key Stage 4 syllabus. So like things like ancient Rome. I'll use that distinction. For completists who are thinking about what about the non-target, usually anything that's not what you're looking at tends to be just neglected as a big blob. But we have distinguished this. Obviously, it's a lot of different things if it's not the target, so, but we've distinguished between some are nearer, some are further away. So we distinguish between associated or single minus, that's closer to the target. In this case, it's other educational knowledge, and unassociated or double minus, that's further away. Here is knowledge from beyond education. I'm not going to use those today. The main thing, though, just to take away at this point, is simply we have a translation device moving between our data and the codings I'm going to give. So I'm not just pulling these out of my arse as I go. And a general sense of what gives those codings. So as I've said, I'll be illustrating them through the rest. So I'm going to use these concepts of focus and autonomy codes, and I'm going to suggest that the teacher I'll discuss achieves an engaged and focused classroom by making explicit what other teachers often leave tacit, doing so for both what and for why, across all three kinds of focus. He doesn't just convey facts from history, he also conveys explanations of those facts, the what and the why. He makes clear both what the students should be doing and why they should be doing it in terms of activities. And he makes clear to students both what is good or bad behaviour and why that matters in terms of their learning. And he does all that through taking autonomy tours that select, recontextualise and integrate knowledge from various sources and bring them home to his target. And to show all this, I'm going to focus on two examples analysed by Sarah Howard and myself and Ellen Lambrinos and Jodie Martin. It's a team effort, not just me, so if anything is unclear at the end, please do ask any of them, not me. In one, the teacher elaborates on the textbook they're reading in class. In the second, he uses a video. And I'll be showing some video myself. As I said, for analysing these things, we need to discuss what, show what's the plus. I said his target, New South Wales, just reminding you, Key Stage 4 history syllabus. The core, the unit is on the medieval world. There's a third level to the device I've not mentioned. I'll just say that in both these examples I'm going to give his inner core, his focus of this specific lesson is weaponry and warfare. Now in this first example, the student's reading aloud from a textbook about castles and sieges. I'll just read that bit first. The student reads this. Gaining control of a castle was an important way for a king or a lord to extend his power, influence and territory and to defeat his enemies. To lay siege to a castle, an army surrounded it with soldiers, trapping its inhabitants inside. Sieges lasted for months or even years, during which time people used all possible means to defend themselves. In most cases, starvation and disease forced the castle's inhabitants to surrender. If these methods failed, attackers then tried to capture the castle by force. I'm now going to show you a video of the teacher elaborating on that reading, and then I'm going to track his track his pathways across the plane. Video is about 2 minutes long, so don't zone out. Hang on. So don't zone out. If you don't follow this, you won't follow the analysis. You won't understand the key points. You won't get the take-home message, and you will be condemned to wander in ignorance forever. Why I'm saying this will become clear when I get to how he does videos. Okay.
Okay, good stuff. All right. So in there, it's talking about a couple of things. One is the importance of the castle. Okay, how important it is, to the Lord for defence. It's also talking about what happens when a castle is put to siege. Now, siege is just a fancy word for when a castle has been encircled, so surrounded, and then basically the attackers just sit back and wait for starvation and disease to happen. Okay, each of you listen now because this part's important. So look up here.
I'll just keep going, I may be a bit long.
And do nothing else. You're lazy, yeah? I'm doing all the
LCT2 is training in Australia.
Another thing you haven't learned about yet, we learn later, with diseases. Okay, now, remember when I showed you the stuff about worst jobs in history in medieval times? That people basically, when they went to the toilet, okay, they'd have their basin bowl, all right, and then they just throw it out onto the street. Okay, that would cause disease. That's all right, man, just take a seat. So, because of the lack of hygiene back then, disease spreads very quickly. Now, you think about yourself. You guys are teenagers, you're going through the best time of your life, so enjoy it. But basically, because of what's happening to you now, okay, hygiene's an issue, right? Hygiene, you have to make sure you do the right thing. Otherwise, you are not going to be popular, all right? People will pick up on the video, etc. Other things will happen. Now, as a result, if you don't, have good hygiene, then, you can start to see things. You might get more pimples than other people. You might have bad BO. You might, your feet might start to get sore, like boils and stuff, yeah? Like your skin will start to peel. That's because poor hygiene. Now that's today, modern day, yeah? Back then, times that by like 20. Okay, it's even worse. And that was a common thing. No one really cared about it, all right? Not unless you were nobility, okay? The king, queen, the family, the royal family, stuff like that. But why I'm telling you this is, you can start to understand because of poor hygiene, disease spreads quickly.
I'm going to pause it there and I'm going to come back to him in a minute. Just to see what he's done so far. So what's happened so far in terms of autonomy codes? So it began with the teacher summarising what the textbook is talking about, importance of castles, what happens when a castle is put to siege, how attackers sit back and wait for starvation and disease to happen. So we're deeply in the sovereign code here. He's not only inside his target, he's in his core, he's in double plus at least, he's in medieval world, he's in warfare and weaponry, he's probably triple plus. But he decides to pick up on something from that extract, which is disease. And he says it's not in this unit, but they will come to it later. So it's in the target of Key Stage 4 history, but it's not core. It's not this unit of study. It's in the sovereign code, but now it's still it's gone down to single pluses. And he then stays here for a while, and he discusses a video they did prior to this unit on worst jobs in history, using that memory to describe a link between hygiene and disease. People using basin bowls, throwing them in the street. So because of that, because of a lack of hygiene back then, disease spreads quickly. Then he moves to students' everyday experiences, that they're teenagers, that hygiene is an issue, that ignoring their hygiene has consequences, and he goes on to describe how poor hygiene causes pimples, BOs, boils, and so on. We're a long way from medieval history at this point. But then he does two things that good teachers often do. He shifts what he's discussing back to history, strengthens positional autonomy. He comes back to the Black Death in the past, and at the same time, he turns that to purpose. He strengthens relational autonomy. He explains why we're talking about these various examples. We're back to the topic of disease. And he explicitly signals this shift by saying, why I'm telling you this is, and summarizing the point, because of poor hygiene, disease spreads quickly. But we're not totally home yet. He's not brought that knowledge of disease back to the topic of castles and sieges. So let's have a look at how he gets all the way back. Hello?
Think about the Black Death. Remember the fleas? They'd bite people, they'd spread the disease. They thought it was the rats. Okay, same deal. Hygiene was terrible. Okay, the conditions they were living in, so they were so cramped, humid. Think about outside today, humidity, yeah? It's sticky. As a result, mosquitoes breed. Okay, the more mosquitoes, the more bites you get. If you're like me, you get bitten to death, that's okay. Alright, that's because of the conditions. Now, inside the castle, imagine you've been at siege, you've been in the castle for a month or two. Food's running out, water's running out. Okay, and then someone gets the Black Death. Do you think you're going to survive? You're in serious trouble because you can't go outside. You go outside, they're going to kill you. Okay, that's the idea, you're trapped. Now, why am I telling you this? One weapon that they use on the enemy here inside the castle, the attackers would actually launch a couple of things over the walls, okay, like catapults. You know what it is, don't you? Don't say a word. Okay. Basically, what they'd launch dead bodies, okay? Not only that, sometimes they'd launch people's heads of the people that were killed. So imagine if your best mate, Tom went outside the fight, he got killed, okay? You're inside the wall going, oh my God, he's dead. And then 2 days later, you see his head fly over the wall, okay? And then next to you, it's going to freak you out, yeah? Now, it's basically, it's terror tactics, okay? It's to create fear and also disease. Okay, if you have dead bodies laying around, there's a chance of disease spreading are very high. There's a reason why when it's our time to go, we get buried on the ground. Okay? So when you think about it, it wasn't just conventional warfare, you know, like bows and arrows, catapults, all that sort of stuff. It was like almost chemical warfare too, diseases. All right, they knew this, yeah? They'd use it to create fear. They'd also fire, catapults with oil and fire in them, so they'd burn the buildings in the middle down. So they're trying to basically eradicate everyone inside and make it uncomfortable for them. All right? So when you think about it, if you're at siege, if you're inside the castle, you're in trouble. Okay? You probably wouldn't survive unless a friend of yours or another part of the army came to, free you. Free you from the siege. All right? Now, do me a favour. Put your hand up if you understand what putting siege to a castle means. Put your hand straight up. Do not be lazy.
So, what he does to start with is he uses the same autonomy pathway to reinforce his point. Goes out to everyday experience, to humidity today. As a result, mosquitoes breed, you get more bites. He then does the same thing again by shifting back to historical knowledge. He describes what conditions inside the castle would be like, food's running out, water's running out, someone gets the Black Death, and the fact that you're trapped when you're under siege, you can't go outside, you're in serious trouble. And now he's back, and he's ready now to drive it right home, get back to his starting point. He brings it back to where he wants to be right now by bringing disease back to siege warfare and showing how disease was a weapon. Attackers would launch dead bodies. If you have dead bodies lying around, chances of disease spreading are very high. It's not just conventional warfare, it's almost chemical warfare too, diseases. Moreover, he does that explicitly. He again begins by saying, now why am I telling you this? Okay, that might seem long and complex. There's only 5 minutes of lesson and key points are actually quite simple. He took them on an autonomy tour. He didn't stay inside medieval warfare because he had to explain why disease could be a weapon. But he didn't vanish off into everyday examples of hygiene and never return. He brought it back home. I call the pathway he took a return trip. It was a staged return trip in this case. He first moved within the sovereign code from warfare to disease, from the content of that lesson to other history lessons, a code drift from core to ancillary parts of his target. He did a code shift to the exotic code, way out actually into the exotic code to students' everyday experiences. And he returned the same way, a code shift back to the issue that they'll cover in another unit, disease, and then a code drift back to the core content of that lesson, warfare in medieval world. So first he went on an autonomy tour. Second, he made explicit both the what and the why. He explicitly pointed to disease as what needs discussion, and twice he explicitly said why he's discussing it. And thirdly, I've been talking about content focus or history knowledge, but he also makes explicit directional focus and behavioral focus. This quote comes immediately before the student reads the textbook. He begins by reassuring those who don't have a textbook with them, which is why he's saying these things. He says, if you don't have a textbook, that's okay. You've just got to listen, all right, how this is going to work. I'm going to ask you to read. I don't have a textbook, so it's no big deal. I'll just listen to you as well. Now, if you're not paying attention, I'm going to ask you the word that we're up to, the exact word, and if you get it wrong, that's 5 minutes of your recess gone. So he says what they need to do, listen carefully or they might stay behind. That seems really obvious, but we've seen many teachers not telling students they're meant to be reading along or listening, and then they don't. So he makes the what explicit for both directional focus about the activity and the behavioral focus of the potential consequences of the misbehavior. And he also makes explicit why they're doing this activity. He says the reason we do this is because some people are visual learners. Now it doesn't matter whether ideas of visual learners and oral learners are nonsense or not. The point here is that he's making explicit not only the what but also the why. He says they will read and they will use videos in order to try and capture and cover everyone. Okay, I'm going to come back to what all that means for my first question after a second example of a different kind of activity. I'll just say now, he never has to carry out his threat, by the way, of keeping anyone behind. They are really on task. This second example comes from using a YouTube video, and it's from earlier in the same lesson. Now, videos are a common part of the multimodal, multimedia, modern classroom. They're often not educational, either in content or purpose. So if we use autonomy codes, we can start to see how complex using them is. Typically, their content is a mixture of stronger or weaker positional autonomy. They contain some of the knowledge. Some of what they contain is the knowledge that the teacher wants to get across. But there's also a lot of other stuff too. So both those codes. They're in both those parts of the plane, and they're rarely custom made for a teacher's target purpose. They don't go on YouTube and look up New South Wales Key Stage 4 history curriculum, entertaining thing about the medieval world. It's often for some other purpose. It's either for entertainment or in the general sense of being educational. It's weaker relational autonomy. So we have knowledge expressed in these videos appearing across these two codes, moving back and forward around in there as it goes along. We have what the teachers want the students to learn in the sovereign code. That's their content focus. That's what they want them to learn and why they want them to learn it. And there's another code too when they're doing these things, when they're using videos, because watching videos, that's an activity, and that often involves directional focus. It involves telling the students what they're meant to be doing, and that's a Roman code. Why? Well, the directions may be turned to purpose. They might be what the teacher hopes to achieve. They might be oriented towards learning target knowledge, stronger relational autonomy, but the directions themselves, you're going to be doing this, you're going to write this down, you're going to watch this, what they're telling them to do are a means to an end, they're not the end in itself. The discourse that's directed towards learning that content knowledge is not itself that content knowledge, so they're weaker positional autonomy if you're actually analysing what they're saying when they're telling them what to do. So it makes it a Roman code. So in other words, teachers using videos, it's really bloody complex. They have to articulate and deal with all four codes at once if they want to integrate these resources successfully. How do you do that? This is how this teacher does it. We begin at the start of the lesson. First he writes the directions on the whiteboard. From the short video, write one paragraph describing what castles were built, where they were built, who built them. The quote marks are from literacy skills that are integrated into curriculum at this key stage. I'm going to show you a brief video. It lasts only 2.5 minutes, and then I'm going to track his pathways, okay? So pay attention. I may ask exactly where we are, exactly what is said, to the word, and if you don't get it, you may have to stay behind at the end of the conference.
After you copy this down, there's about a 5-minute video clip we'll watch. After we watch it, we'll talk about it a little bit, and then you're going to answer this question. Okay, so in your answer, you're looking to write down, why were the castles built in the first place? What was their purpose? Where were they built? Were they built in the middle of nowhere, in the desert, on a hill, whatever? And finally, who built them? Okay, so was it Indians? Was it Americans? Was it British? Etc. Okay, so simple questions just to get us started, because the next week and a half, 2 weeks, this is the topic we'll be doing. Okay. You're going to get little work booklets as well that are going to be photocopied hopefully today. So next week on Tuesday, when I have you, you'll get your work booklet. And the focus is on attacking a castle and also defending it. Okay, so what would you have to do if you were in charge of attacking or defending? When you finish, just put your pen down so I know where we're up to. Okay, so what we'll do, put the video on, you know how it works. Don't have to worry about taking any notes today, just watch it closely. It only goes for 5 minutes, so it'll be over fairly quickly. But it gives you a rough idea, yeah?
There's a clicker there if you want.
That's okay.
The placement of forts often depend on the terrain, high ground, rocky outcrops, commanding positions. Defences within forts and castles are places of refuge, and needed to be large enough to accommodate many.
Okay, well, I'll answer the door. You just start to answer the question, yeah? So, where were they built? Were they built on nice flat land, like a desert? Yes or no? No, where were they built? Correct. On top of a hill, high terrain, gives you an advantage. Thank you. Okay, so first part of the question, alright, so it says, where were they built? Alright, so you're looking, like you said, for an answer saying, high terrain, okay, so rocky outcrops. Basically, it says in there, what did it say? Why were they built on top of hills? What was the advantage? Yep? Good. Okay, because they're elevated position, they can overlook the lower ground. And if you think about it, if you put archers on top of a castle, which is already on top of a hill, okay, due to gravity, they can shoot a lot further, they have an advantage. Okay, and it slows the enemy down because they've not only got to climb a mountain, they have to climb the walls once they get to the top of the mountain. Alright?
Okay. So he began by explaining the activity, directional focus. He said they'd watch a video, discuss it, answer the questions, and he explained why. They're simple questions because we're just starting this topic. So his directional focus, both what and why, are made explicit. Then he starts playing a YouTube video on the design, video from YouTube on the design of Roman and medieval castles. As I said, it's a mixture of Trojan and exotic codes. He stopped the video. He found some target content knowledge about the placement of forts. And he prompted the students to answer the question about where they were built. He suggested the wrong answer of nice flat land like a desert, which is solicited on top of hills from a student. So he's identified and he's selected content that's stronger positional autonomy from what he wants to teach. And he strengthened relational autonomy by turning it to the purpose of answering the question, learning, or what they're supposed to be learning. But as usual, he doesn't just do what, he also does why. Why were they built there? What was the advantage? Students give some suggestions. And then he elaborates other examples as well. Archers on top of a hill could shoot further. People running up the hill would be slowed down. That's all content focus. And he's identified his content, he's brought it home nicely. But he doesn't just go and turn the video back on at this point. He does something else, which I'm going to show you. It only takes 40 seconds. Here we go.
So first part of your answer, 2 to 3 lines, just explaining where they were built. And you've already got reasons why that was the case as well, yeah? Give you 1 minute, I'll start back up and we'll move on. 30 seconds, and we'll start back up. So we've already answered one of the areas that we're looking for, you've got 2 to go. Okay? So you've got where they were built, now you're looking for who, you've already got some answers for that, and also why. And why you sort of have half answered as well, yeah?
So, he doesn't just... I've shown that he brings content home, but he doesn't just restart the video, he prepares the students to repeat the move. He switches to directional focus and he explicitly relates the knowledge they've just done to the task of the 3 questions on the whiteboard. He discusses how they've done one question, they've started on answers for another. So he's making clear in terms of the activity as an activity, both the what they've just discussed and the why that matters. And having set them up to repeat the content moves, he restarts the video. So to summarize, he establishes what they're doing and why. Watch the video. He then selects target knowledge that's got stronger positional autonomy. He strengthens the relational autonomy. He brings home this content. He turns it to the target purpose. And finally, he connects that knowledge to the task. He switches to directional focus and discusses how they're answering questions, which prepares them to return to the video again. So what does that tell us? Well, first it shows that integrating knowledge from videos demands a lot from teachers. It's not just when they do it well, it's not just a case of flick on the video and bugger off, if they're going to do it well. They have to select appropriate content, they have to recontextualize that content for a new purpose, connecting it both to the activity of engaging with the video and to the knowledge the students are meant to be learning through it, which involves both code shifting and focus shifting. And secondly, I've illustrated that this teacher has a signature pathway, which he does versions of repeatedly through this activity until they've answered all the questions on the whiteboard. To repeat myself, that pathway can be summarized as setup, start activity, select target knowledge, pedagogize that knowledge to its purpose, and taskify it back to the task, setting them up for another cycle. And by using that pathway, students always know what they're meant to be learning and why, what they're meant to be doing and why, and how they're meant to behave and why. In fact, the teacher doesn't mention behavior very much because the students are actually engaged through all these classes with the activities. The result is that there was a lot more content taught in these classes that we were studying than in many other classes. And by repeating this pathway, he isn't just teaching the students history, he's teaching them principles for selecting, recontextualizing, and enacting knowledge from non-academic media. He's teaching them how to integrate knowledge from diverse sources. Okay, so for fun, let's see what happens when you don't follow this pathway. To make my point, this is a class in the same year, in the same subject, in the same unit. It involves a video, just like before, and it involves a digression about disease, just like the earlier example. The main difference is this school has students from higher social backgrounds. Now, before showing the students a video, this teacher gets the students to write down everything they know about medieval Europe, which she then writes up on the interactive whiteboard. That takes 40 minutes. She then sets up the task of watching a video. She tells the students to highlight on their list what's right in one color, what's wrong on the other when they're watching the video, and what needs clarifying, which she says they'll research next. So her directional focus is there. She's explicit about what and why. I'll come back to that later. The video is the same two codes as the previous example. It's a mixture of target knowledge and non-target knowledge. It's for the purposes of edutainment. And she shows the video for 45 minutes, offering interjections. Example here is a video is discussing the ordeal. And that's where someone on trial places their hand in a cauldron of boiling water. It's bandaged, and after 2 or 3 days, a priest looks to see if it's healing, so you're innocent, or if it's not, which means you're guilty. So it's like a medieval version of applying for research funding. At this point, the teacher interjects to ask, what don't they have in medieval Europe that could help healing? Which might be highlighting some knowledge of stronger positional autonomy. It's not clear as yet. The student, and don't ever fear like putting a question mark and not knowing where you are on the plane. We're not quite sure where we are yet. Students then have to play a game of what Jim calls guessing what's in the teacher's head. And they suggest good healthcare. They have a stab at medicine, but she wants something specific, which one student guesses as antibiotics. So the teacher has moved to the exotic code. That knowledge is not in the syllabus for medieval Europe or Key Stage 4 history, and it's not here yet turned to the purpose of learning that curriculum. It might be, but it's not here. She then talks about how people in the past had poor hygiene. They didn't bathe very often, they didn't wash their clothes regularly, so that they were more prone to infection. Now, superficially, that sounds really similar to my earlier example. And she's almost linking it back to the ordeal by saying it's not the most effective method, so it's heading towards that direction, but it doesn't get there, because this is when the wheels really fall off. I'm going to read this out. She says, there's also been some historical sources that have come out now and tried to replicate some of these medieval European ointments and things, and they found that they do have some antibacterial properties. Some of them have garlic in it. Well, garlic has been proven by science today to have an antibacterial element to it, which is probably why chicken soup is, the go-to thing for when you're sick. I think it's got more to do with the garlic, and they're the antibacterial elements to it. However, for it to actually work, it would probably depend on the bug that you're treating and how much you've got. So I don't know how much garlic you need in order for it to be totally effective against everything. So keep that in mind, because we will just look at that later. Did we watch some of this? Do you want me to skip forward? Inside the heads of the students, I think they're all going, yes. So in terms of the autonomy plane, she's headed on a one-way trip out of medieval Europe, and she doesn't come back. After an hour and 17 minutes of this lesson, because I'm not cherry-picking here, she returns to the purpose of the activity, identifying what on their brainstorm list was neither right nor wrong, and so needs research. And for research, she tells students to Google it, as it's smarter than anyone I know. A student points out that it's just a search engine, and her response is to say, well, it's better than Bing. The wheels have fallen off. There you go. So unlike both the previous examples, the content focus doesn't bring any knowledge home, and she doesn't teach them any principles for selecting and recontextualizing knowledge from other sources. So when faced with whatever Google throws up, they've been taught no basis for selecting knowledge of stronger positional autonomy. They've no means of strengthening the relational autonomy by turning that to the purpose of what they're supposed to be doing. They've been given no modeling for how to bring knowledge back home. Sarah and Eleanor, who spent some time in this classroom, described the students looking pleadingly at them and even mouthing the words, what are we supposed to be doing? So, what are the key points from all that? Well, my first question was, what was the first teacher doing that enables students to focus on learning knowledge? And I've argued that one way is by making explicit not only the what, but also the why, and doing it across content, directional, and behavioral focus. And I showed how he takes return trips to explain and elaborate ideas from materials like textbooks, and tours that select, recontextualize, and integrate knowledge from videos. And in both cases, he brings that knowledge back home. What the hell's that got to do with legitimating LCT? Well, first, it illustrates how LCT makes good practice visible. Much of what that teacher does might not seem It might not seem good. It might not be seen as good teaching. Some see a disengaged or uninterested teacher who lacks passion. That he's successfully building and integrating knowledge is not necessarily visible. That the fact that he's so laid back is actually part of a wider thing that he does about reassuring them all the time. When he says there's only 5 minutes, 10 minutes of the lesson, don't worry about it, he's not sitting there trying to get home, he's trying to keep them calm and relax them. So we often talk about LCT overcoming knowledge blindness to make knowledge visible, but it also makes visible what people do with knowledge. In this case, it makes good teaching visible, so we can teach it to others. Second, LCT makes the principles for building and integrating knowledge visible. This is important because it's not enough to identify a strategy or a trick of the trade and teach that to others. For example, I've set this up by repeatedly saying he's explicit about both the what and the why. And that's just the kind of simple slogan that takes off really nicely in education. But without things like LCT, it's not going to work. It's going to become a cargo cult solution that people imitate with no understanding of why it does or doesn't work in this case. And the other example I gave you showed it. That teacher was explicit about what the students should be doing and why, but then she went on a one-way trip out of history into Garlic and Google and didn't return. The point here is this: being explicit is not enough. Codes matter. It wasn't just that he was explicit, that does help students, it was that he shifted codes and he did in a particular way. When using that video, he selected Trojan code knowledge, he turned it into sovereign code knowledge, and he connected it back to the Roman code activity. He moved around the plane, he moved through autonomy codes, and that's what the Garlic teacher didn't do. So the real key to what he's doing is shown by using pathways to reveal his autonomy tools and how he brings knowledge back home. And because LCT gets beneath the surface features to these underlying principles, because it allows deeper understanding, deeper analysis, we can adapt those points to different contexts. We can show what autonomy tools look like in different subjects, different years, different topics, and so on. So we're not saying always do these practices, we're saying adopt these principles to your practice. They may look different in your context, which is again to say LCT empowers people to translate principles like autonomy tools into their own practices using their own expertise. Third, LCT dissolves dichotomies. What I've discussed there doesn't take sides in the old tedious big dichotomy. It's not about teacher-centered or student-centered, traditional or constructivist, and that's true for all the binary choices of positivism and post-theory and qualitative and quantitative and so on. They're based on either-or thinking that sets out a single code or set of codes that will solve everything and paints another set of codes as the problem. Instead, as I've been saying, the answer is always negotiating many codes, moving around planes, being able to take different pathways as and when needed. For example, in the rest of the lessons, that first teacher didn't just grind out the same pathway over and over. Sometimes the students didn't follow him, he turned back, he retraced his steps, or he took a different path, but he always came home in the end. And that point is true for all legitimation codes, whatever you use. Semantic waves say that we must show that we must move between and weave together different semantic codes. It doesn't valorize theoretical knowledge over practical knowledge. Similarly, specialization doesn't say knowledge code good, Noah code bad, or elite code is the answer. All codes have attributes that are useful for something. The point is to figure out what they can do so that we can say to others, given what you want to do, these codes will help you, these codes will not. Or weaving this way will help, or this pathway will get you to where you want to go. The fields we work in often believe that there is one code to rule them all. But autonomy shows that you have to go there and back again across a bunch of different codes. So LCT allows us to refuse to choose the lesser of two evils in fields where the good is not visible because binary constellations are obscuring everything but two bad choices. We can make the invisible visible. We can empower people to see and choose a different way of doing things. And I'm going to finish off by saying why that matters more broadly. In our lifetimes, there's never been more need for a different way of doing things than now. We are witnessing everywhere the rapid rise of a rationalism of every stripe. Populism, fascism, racism, fundamentalism, climate change denial, the list goes on. And we've come together at this conference from dozens of countries in which these are wreaking havoc. For example, in the most powerful country in the world, a bankrupt celebrity is now the dumbest president of all time. And the country of my birth has committed economic and political suicide by voting for Brexit. Slugs for salt. The people most hurt by those decisions are the people who voted for them. This rationalism is often being undermined by the tools of the trade of so-called critical theories. All claims are equally valid. It's just perspective. You can have your own alternative facts. Now, against this, we are beginning to see a reaction. Events such as March for Science, lots of books are now going to be coming out, and they're already coming out saying we need experts, we need facts, we need reason, and so on. And these are obviously important, but they're not enough, because we are on the verge of repeating the same old big dichotomy, underpinned by the same old binary cosmology, reproducing that either-or, reproducing that which side are you on, universalizing mindset. Now, what I'm pointing to isn't new. How these oppositions play out in the wider world has been theorized regularly in sociology. So, for example, Manuel Castells synthesized a range of theories to argue that the chief dynamic of the modern world is what he called the bipolar opposition of the net and the self. He wrote that the new forms taken by neoliberal capitalism, or the net, mean people experience power as faceless and placeless, as constantly shifting and abstract and distant from their experiential world. And he said against this, people are asserting what he called the self, identities that are more personal, concrete, grounded, and less changing, like nationalism and tribalism. And that opposition resonates with what many commentators argue, that people feel power has shifted to an impersonal, abstract, complex realm in which, for example, corporations are unaccountable to anyone but other corporations who are their shareholders, and they're located nowhere but everywhere. And people are often commentators say that people are now being attracted very much to local, simple solutions. Make America great again. Put Britain first. However, commentators and theorists like Castells cannot analyze the principles of these positions because they can't see knowledge. So, for example, 3-volume work, modern classic, called The Information Age, and Castells defines information and knowledge in a footnote in which he distinguishes knowledge from news and entertainment. That doesn't help when those three are becoming interchangeable. But LCT does make knowledge visible, so we can see more of what's happening. We can use specialization and semantics and see that what we're witnessing is a double code clash between the rhizomatic knowledge code of the net, the complex, abstract, impersonal, and the prosaic Noah code of the self, the simpler, the concrete, the personal, it's the same old big dichotomy again. And we can use a constellation analysis to show that what will happen when notions of truth and evidence and expertise and science and so on are constructed as also being rhizomatic knowledge code. Basically, to use a technical term, it's technical, it's in a book. Rationality is clusterfucked. By association, it's the same codes by association. Science, evidence, facts are associated with neoliberalism, corporations, globalization, unaccountable bureaucracies, and so on, and opposed to the everyday experiences of people and their identities. So the big dichotomy has reached out and is now including, from academia, is including the economic and political realms. Now, of course, we need far more detailed and careful analysis of this than I've just given, but findings of Eleanor Glenn's PhD on how people understand climate change at least suggests that this might be plausible. The question this raises is, how can LCT help us move forward? How can it make a small contribution? 3 ways. First, it highlights the need to understand and speak in the language of prosaic Noah codes. It can help us express what we do, for example, in ways less easily caricatured as part of that technicist, cold, inhuman, scientific constellation, so that we can fight against being associated with reactionary economic and political forces. Second, LCT can help with teaching people other codes. As many papers at this conference will show, the notion of semantic waves helps to expand people's semantic range beyond the concrete and simple. It also helps expand people's specialization range beyond their personal experience to embrace specialized procedures, specialized skills. This raises a question that you might be having, which is, if you keep talking about this big dichotomy and I'm looking at it and it looks like it's specialization and semantics, why did you just do 50 minutes on autonomy tours? Well, it's simple, thank you for asking. To help people expand their range requires autonomy tours. What's forgotten by scholars who valorize academic knowledge over everyday knowledge and everyday experience is that we live in the everyday. We spend a lot of our lives in prosaic Noah codes, in concrete, simple, and personal meanings. And for many people, those codes are all they ever experience, at least positively. And LCT can help us shape teaching or public interventions to encourage people to take autonomy tours in which they can have positive experiences of more abstract, specialized, and complex knowledge, and then bring that knowledge back home to their everyday experience. Because it's worth noting, I never said autonomy tours start and end in academic knowledge. They did in my examples because the teacher's target was that. But targets of other people might be doing their best for their kids, or trying to get secure employment, or making a relationship work, or something like that. And we can use LCT to shape autonomy towards the begin and end in those targets where people live. And that brings me to my last point. All codes matter. All have value. Your personal experience is valuable for some things, but not quite so good for understanding the open, complex system of climate change. Scientific theories can explain that pretty well, but they're ineffective often in connecting with your felt experience. That idea that the codes have value for different things is often made invisible by the big dichotomy, which demands you choose a side. And valorizing one set of codes while condemning another is what underpins our current political disaster. And in contrast, LCT points to semantic waves, they move up and down, and autonomy tours, and they don't say one code's the answer, they argue for moving between codes. They show that being able to negotiate all the codes is crucial to knowledge building and to empowering knowers. They deny the big dichotomy, and they make that different way of thinking visible. So to end where I began, what is LCT? What's the point? Well, in addition to what I've already argued, we'll see this week how LCT can be used to analyze a wide range of topics across a whole plethora of different national and institutional contexts. We hear papers that are building on previous work to develop ideas with greater explanatory power and greater emancipatory potential. And those papers will use LCT in both research and teaching practice. And they'll ultimately all be aimed at making the invisible visible so people can understand, change, and improve their lives and the lives of others. Which means that you are indeed a bunch of benevolent misfits, reshaping what's possible, fucking with the status quo, thinking the unthinkable, denying those dichotomies that separate us from each other and from ourselves. So as you spend the next few days waving and weaving and touring and aiming to make the world a better place, I have to say it really is a privilege to be among you. Thank you very much.